Welcome, everybody, today to what I think is going to turn out to be a balmy Friday afternoon here in Dallas, Texas. Thank you all for being here. I think most of you know me, but for those of you who don't, I'm Ray Rafiti. I'm the Senior Associate Director here in the Tower Center and also a co-conspirator, collaborator, colluder, I guess, with Sabri Atesh on all things Middle Eastern. And when I met with Douglas Silliman a couple of years ago and talked about bringing him out here, I assured him we'd always have good crowds for Middle East events. And so I want to thank all my fellow Dallasites for making me an honest man, at least this one time in my life today. But I also want to introduce Sabri. Again, he's our history professor here, and teaches all our Middle East politics courses. We've worked together quite a bit on Middle East events. I know some of you have been to a lot of these, so we hope to have you more of these, and we're looking forward to a good one today. And without further ado, I will let Sabri introduce our distinguished guests, as well as our ambassador, who's also a distinguished guest. So take it away, Sabri.
Thank you. Thank you, Ray. And everybody, welcome. It's great seeing most of you that I know from our other events. So before we begin, allow me to extend my sincere gratitude to several individuals whose efforts have made our gathering today and other times possible. I'll start with our board members, Jean Tower Cox and Bob Jordan, who are here and always support our efforts. And then my good friend, Professor James Hollifull, Director of Tower Center, whose leadership and vision are the driving forces behind Center's remarkable productivity and impact. And where is Ray? I also want to thank Ray. He's the Senior Associate Director, whose unwavering commitment ensures that the Middle East remains a vital part of the intellectual discourse on campus. And also whose efforts brings distinguished guests, I guess we will keep saying this, into our academic community. And finally, I'm also very grateful to Astrid Galman Segura, who meticulously arranges our logistics planning and ensures really the seamless execution of events. So thank you all. And finally, our distinguished guest, Ambassador Douglas Silliman. He is the president of Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington. Now, this name, of course, as you know, is, as I was reading, is this Arab Gulf or Arab Gulf States? That was my joke, but we'll come to that. This Gulf is another controversial Gulf now, or has been. So he's the president of Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington and a distinguished former American diplomat with a 35-year career in U.S. Foreign Service. He served as U.S. Ambassador to Iraq from 2016 to 2019 and was ambassador at Kuwait from 2014 to 2016. And he also held senior roles in the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs, particularly focused on Iraq and U.S. Africa Leaders Summit. His earlier assignments included Deputy Chief of Mission in both Iraq and Turkey, as well as political roles in Jordan, Pakistan, Tunisia, and Haiti, as we learned last night. That's where he started his career. Within the Department of State, he held several leadership and advisory roles, including Director of the Office of Southern European Affairs and Regional Officer for the Middle East in the Office of the Coordinator for Counterterrorism. He also served in various policy and support capacities, dealing with the Soviet Union, Lebanon, and the broader Near East and South Asia. He has been widely recognized for his service and received numerous recognitions for that, including the Presidential Distinguished Service Award in 2018. He holds a BA in political science from Baylor University down the road, and holds an MA in international relations from George Washington University. He is fluent in Arabic and French. In addition to his role as president of the Institute, he also serves on the board of advisors of the bilateral U.S. Arab Chamber of Commerce and is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the American Academy of Diplomacy. I'm also very happy to have him accompanied by another distinguished foreign, not foreign, a diplomat who is also with us here, his wife, Catherine Silliman. Now, I know after this talk, all of you guys will go to Amazon and look for a book called Veils in the Vanguard: Insights of an American Ambassador's Wife in Kuwait. Available on Amazon in Kindle and in print. So we're very glad you accompanied Ambassador Silliman here. All right, without further ado, now I will introduce our distinguished guests.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for coming today. Sabri, thank you for that introduction. Thank you for the sales pitch for my wife's book. I appreciate that. I want to say also thank you and welcome to some special people. First of all, Ray Rafidi. Ray is the reason that I'm here. He made all the arrangements, and we meet every time he comes to Washington, and there's always an interesting conversation, and he tells me what's going on here, and I try to explain to him what's going on in the Middle East, and hopefully he brings some of that back to the Tower Center. And I also wanted to recognize my wife, Catherine, who's here with us, a partner and co-worker for 35 years, not only in raising two very impressive young men as our sons, but also dealing with the silliness that we did and dealt with in the Middle East and South Asia throughout our careers. But even further than that, I've got some folks who sort of, we were associated at that little school down I-35 a few years ago who happened to be in Dallas this weekend. So Juan and Gary Vogelwater and Tammy Wilson, thank you guys for coming and being with us today. Before I start my remarks, so I want to kind of start with a confession. I'm a Cold War kid. I was born in 1960, and it was clear to me as I got a little bit older that everything was divided in half. There were Americans and there were Russians. There was the West and there was the East, and there were Democrats with a little d and communists. And everybody in the world saw this as the way that life should be. Countries leaned toward one party or the other for a big part of the history after World War II. So I grew up in my bipolar world. I studied Russian and Soviet politics. In 1984, joined the US Foreign Service. But then in 1991, I just happened to be on the Soviet Union desk, and my bipolar world took a really big hit. There was a military coup against Gorbachev. Boris Yeltsin went nowhere. The Soviet Union collapsed, and 15 countries came out of what was once the USSR. And within just a few weeks, my old bipolar world had become America's unipolar world. As many of you will recall, it was a really good time to be an American, and it was a particularly heady time to be an American diplomat, because everybody everywhere, except maybe the Cubans and the North Koreans, came to us, asked our advice, wanted our political, military, or material support for their projects. And in many parts of the world, including Europe and Asia, and including China, under US global leadership, the Pax Americana reduced the risk of a Cold War conflict after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and governments focused more on economic development. I guess they thought that if they did not need as many swords, they could make a few more plowshares. So capitalism and international trade flourished. People started talking about globalization. And the world was squarely focused now on the United States, which went on to create a geopolitical and a geoeconomic order that was made to order for US business and US strategic interests at the time that it was founded. And several significant things happened during this period. One, we really entered a Pax Americana. While the United States had a lot of security roles between World War II and the end of the Soviet Union, after the fall of the Soviet Union, we essentially single-handedly guaranteed the geostrategic order that we had put in place. Some people thought this meant that we were the world's policemen. Other people simply thought it was good for American business. And whichever side of the balance you were on, it was still an American project. Second, NATO expanded because many of the countries that had lived either as part of the Soviet Union or under Russian domination decided they did not ever want to be back there again. So they came in droves and wanted to make sure they had military protection in Europe and not in the East. The same thing happened in Western Europe because the EU expanded. They deepened what they did in coordination. They brought in some more countries in the East. They created a common currency to help unify the economy. And at the same time, they disinvested in security and decided that they were happy to let the United States run and secure this new geopolitical under one pole, the United States. Now, for the United States, we were the target of everybody who didn't like anything going on anywhere in the world. So whether it's North Korea or Osama bin Laden or leftist demonstrators against polarization, everybody sort of began to blame the United States. Partially because of this, but not entirely. We fought 2 wars of choice in Afghanistan and Iraq. And not in addition to the troops we had deployed in Europe and in Asia, we deployed 10,000 more troops into the Middle East. And this was, for most of my career, America's unipolar world. But the world has changed again. Investing investments in Europe, in Asia, in Latin America, and parts of the Middle East have brought an era of consistent economic growth to a much broader part of the world than in the past. And while the economy of the United States has grown very, very quickly, the economies of other countries in much of the world have grown even faster. For example, in 1960, global GDP was $1.4 trillion, and the US economy made up 40% of that amount. But by 40 years later, in the year 2000, even though the US economy had grown 20-fold to more than $10 billion, it made up only about 30% of the global economy. And this year, the IMF projects that we will have an economic GDP of more than $30 trillion for the first time, but it's likely to be only 26% of global GDP. In absolute terms, the United States is still the largest, the most technologically advanced, the most efficient, and the most innovative economy in the world, but others are catching up to us, and we have to be conscious of that. This period of economic growth has produced a number of countries which have begun to prioritize their own interests as they define them over the interests of a bloc or an ideological group. And let me say that again. This period of economic growth has permitted and encouraged a number of countries to pursue their own interests as they define them, absent ideological or membership in a bloc. Chief among these right now are China and Russia, and that's not really surprising to anybody, but they're not alone. Turkey, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, Mexico, India, South Africa, and even smaller countries like Israel and United Arab Emirates have begun to take policy decisions, security, economic, social, in isolation from anybody else because they think that's the thing that their country ought to be doing. What the world now faces is not 2 superpowers in my bipolar world or 1 superpower in my unipolar world. It's a multipolar world. And frankly, I don't like that term because most of these superpowers are not trying to create a political or economic pole around themselves. They're simply trying to maximize the benefits of economic connections and political connections and security connections as broadly as they can make. So I see that this new world is not multipolar, it is hyper-connected or networked. Now, while this phenomenon has occurred all over the world and in many places and will continue to occur, I want to focus a bit on the Middle East and talk about how our relationships in the Middle East have shifted in just the past decade. Traditionally, Cairo, Damascus, and Baghdad have been the centers of power, economic activity, and intellectual ferment, for Egypt and Baghdad going back 10,000 years. But the modern countries of Egypt, Syria, and Iraq did not benefit from the great economic expansion that I just talked about. They had problems with poor governance, dictatorship, war, and instead of continuing the leadership role, this role in the Middle East has been taken over by new countries, upstarts, Arab states that have money, that have strong leadership and have come up with a direction that they are now able to pursue. And I want today to talk specifically about two of those countries, United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia. So let's start with the UAE. The UAE is a small country. It has only 10.5 million people. It's about the size of the state of Maine, where Catherine and I have a house, so we know exactly how big that is. But only out of that 10.5 million residents, only 1.3 million are citizens. So that means that 9 out of every 10 people you meet on the streets in Dubai or Abu Dhabi are not Emirati. You also probably have heard of Abu Dhabi and Dubai. The thing about the Emirates is it's kind of like the United States. It's made up of 7 different semi-independent emirates, principalities, each with its own identity, its history, and a leadership cadre. Only 2 of them have really made world attention. Abu Dhabi is the capital. Abu Dhabi is the oil-rich province. And they fund a lot of the activities in the 6 other emirates. The second is Dubai. And Dubai has built its wealth on trade, investment, business, free zones, logistics, and bravado. Honestly, Dubai is a loud place. It's constantly moving. And with that has come a lot of money, a lot of economic activity, but they take more risks. Maybe they don't look so closely at the books when things are coming through customs. And it's a little bit riskier approach to economics. And Abu Dhabi and Dubai sometimes clash a bit on the way that they have run their country, because in Abu Dhabi, the government would like to plan everything, invest, and have a proper path forward for the entire country. The Emirates started real modernization almost 20 years ago and are far ahead of anybody else in the region except for Israel. They have invested in logistics, in energy, obviously, refining. They are now investing heavily in artificial intelligence, in data management, renewable energy, healthcare, food security, water security. They're basically going to use their current income from hydrocarbons to prepare the country for the period in the future when they are going to be one of the most affected regions in the world from climate change, in both temperature change, shortage of water, and sea level rise, and the eventual decline in the use of oil, probably within 50 or 60 years at least, no longer being the primary fuel used around the world. And they are planning now for that 2 generations ahead of us result. But it's a small country with big ambitions, and it does not have enough people to actually people those ambitions and staff them. So it imports workers from all over the world. They claim to have more than 200 languages spoken in the UAE. And they don't just import maids and taxi drivers and construction workers. They import CEOs and CFOs and researchers and professors and lawyers and people who can actually make the machinery of economics work for the Emirates. How is this going to affect the United States? Because particularly in the Trump administration, you're going to hear a lot about US relations with the UAE and also Saudi Arabia. Well, the Emirates have been a significant partner of ours going back a couple of decades. They helped us in Iraq. They helped us a bit in Afghanistan. They want to have a treaty-bound defense relationship with the United States, but at the same time, they are concerned that the United States is becoming a less reliable security partner. And again, we can talk about this in the Q&A if you want, but it's a very complicated contradiction in positions that taken at the same time by Abu Dhabi. The UAE is also playing a global role. For example, a senior Emirati official last week passed a letter from President Trump to the foreign minister of Iran to be passed to Ayatollah Khamenei, which I guess they replied to yesterday through Oman, not through the UAE. But they want to help the United States calm down the region and make sure that they are playing a positive role. On the economy, they have launched significant long-term partnerships with Microsoft, IBM, Cleveland Clinic, NASA on AI, data centers, healthcare, space exploration. They're likely to keep buying high-end American military equipment, aviation equipment, computer equipment, technology, and send students here to do research, because this is the best place in the world to do research. And maybe most importantly for this administration, In 2020, the UAE was the first country to sign an Abraham Accord normalizing the relationship between the UAE and Israel. And I will tell you that the Emiratis are convinced that this is for the good of the Emirates. They are in this agreement, even with the violence in Gaza and what has happened after the Hamas terrorist attack. They think that the Israeli and Emirati economies are complementary. They're both small countries. They see sort of surrounded by enemies, and they believe that there is a relationship that is positive for both sides that can come out of this normalization. Let me turn quickly to Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia is a completely different country, a completely different story from the Emirates, even though they're really close together in the Gulf. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt met King Abdulaziz Ibn Saud on the deck of a USS Destroyer on the approach to the Suez Canal in February of 1945, and that basically started the modern era of relations between the United States and Saudi Arabia, particularly trade in oil. But as I think back over my life, at the times that Saudi Arabia has kind of hit me in the face in the US media, it's mostly bad. I mean, I remember 1974, the Saudi oil embargo forced, my father and maybe others in the room to wait in line at gas stations because there was not enough gasoline available. In 2001, 15 of the 19 terrorists in the 9/11 attacks were Saudi citizens. In 2015, 2016, particularly from Democrats, there was a lot of criticism of civilian casualties in Saudi Arabia's attempt to overthrow the Houthi government in Yemen. And in 2018, the murder and dismemberment of journalist Jamal Khashoggi in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul still upsets an awful lot of people, particularly in the journalist community. I think that Saudi Arabia, even though it has been a long-term friend, has been such a quiet one that these particular bad incidents could still end up damaging the relationship. And I think that the Trump administration and future administrations need to take a fresh look from the base at how the United States and Saudi Arabia need to operate. So let me just go through a little bit about what I think is going on in Saudi Arabia. Just outline what's on there, and Saudis want us involved as well in what's happening there. Since Prince Mohammed bin Salman became crown prince, he has used his position with the support of his father, King Salman, to institute a truly revolutionary top-down social and economic reform program. It's called Vision 2030. You've probably already heard that Saudi women can drive, have been able to drive since 2018. They've also made other reforms so that Saudi women can get a job, go to the doctor, get a passport, travel overseas without the permission of a male relative, which was not possible 5 years ago. Mohammed bin Salman is trying to change the fundamental view of Saudi citizens of their country, and he's trying to upgrade or modernize their national narrative, trying to remove Islam from the reasons that Saudi Arabia exists, and he's creating touchstones. Prior to the old touchstone was the deal between Al Saud and Abdul Wahab religious leader. He's removed the religious police. He used to enforce strict Islamic dress codes and behavior codes on Saudi citizens. And the ministries of tourism and culture are actively going around Saudi Arabia into elementary schools and into local clubs, looking for children who have skills in what they consider, I'll put this in quotes, authentic Saudi culture. Things that were tribal or linguistic, music, dancing, art that predated Islam, so that they can add that to their narrative that Saudi Arabia was Saudi Arabia before Islam became the twin relative. On the economy, Vision 2030 has resulted in huge amounts of investment. One thing that I have been taken by is the amount of money that they are putting into tourism. They are trying to get Saudis not to travel to New York or on vacation. They want them to stay in Saudi Arabia. So they are bringing interesting people to Saudi Arabia to make sure Saudis want to stay in Saudi Arabia. So the Portuguese soccer star Cristiano Ronaldo now plays for the Saudi soccer team Al Nassr. Janet Jackson, 50 Cent, Alicia Keys, Pharrell Williams, Bruno Mars, and many other Western performers have done concerts, including outdoor concerts with men and women in the desert outside of Riyadh in the past 5 years. Vision 2030 also includes massive development programs, mostly real estate development projects. I'll just name two of them because there's so many big ones. There's something called The Line in northwestern mountains of Saudi Arabia, which is planned to be a building that was originally going to be 94 miles long. Maybe now it'll be 50 miles long. But by 2030, they are well on track to completing a building with glass sides that is 400 feet taller than the Empire State Building, wider than the Astrodome, and by 2030 should be 1.5 miles long. In Riyadh, they're making something that they call the Cube, and it is literally a cube 1,300 feet high, 1,300 feet wide, and 1,300 feet deep. And they're planning on having an entirely different ecosystem and a population that doesn't even have to leave the cube if they don't want to. While all this is going on, in the UAE, they've had to import people to do all the work that the Emiratis want to do. In Saudi Arabia, they're trying to convince Saudis to work. And what they have done is encourage Saudi women to take on jobs. They've encouraged Saudis to go into fields where they feel that there is not the educational depth in the Saudi population to take on leadership and research roles. In 2018, the Saudi labor force was about 20% women. Today, it's just over 1/3. And that is a remarkably steep rise in labor participation for women in just 8 years. More than 500,000 Saudi students in the past 15 years have come to school and gotten degrees in the United States. A couple of 100,000 others have gone to the UK, to Australia, to Germany, France, and other Western countries. And these kids are coming back to Saudi Arabia with a different view of the world, a different view of education, and frankly, different expectations for life going forward. And they may not transform Saudi society, but they will certainly be influential in the way that things are done. Now, one can criticize a lot of the things that I've talked about for both the Saudis and the Emiratis. These big construction projects, they're all over budget, they're behind schedule, but they're continuing to go forward. The job that the women have tend to be in the retail sector, and they pay less than some other jobs, but still that gives women income and the ability to contribute monetarily to the family. And interestingly, there seems to be overwhelming support thus far from most Saudis for all of these social and economic reforms. So how does this affect relations with the United States? First of all, on the security front, there was a huge investment of time and effort by the Biden administration to negotiate two separate agreements with Saudi Arabia. One would be a treaty-bound defense, mutual defense treaty. The other was a framework relationship to deal with all the other parts of the relationship. They were nearly complete on the eve of the Hamas attack, October 7th, 2023, and that has upended the politics behind them a bit. But one of the main goals that the Biden administration had in pursuing these agreements was to link U.S. Saudi cooperation to a Saudi normalization of relations with Israel. And it was essentially a three-legged stool where if there could be benefits for each of the three sides in a triangular deal, this might actually go forward. And for Israelis, normalization with Saudi Arabia is the holy grail of normalization. They believe that once the Saudis go and recognize Israel, that most other Arab countries, except a few holdouts, will follow soon after that. The problem, though, in Saudi Arabia is even though that they are de-emphasizing the role of Islam in their society, Mecca and Medina and the annual Muslim Hajj are still in Saudi Arabia. The king of Saudi Arabia is still considered the leader of Islam, politically, of Islam around the world. And they take that role seriously, even though they're pushing it a little bit to the side of their national narrative. Saudi Arabia would be very happy to sign these two deals with the United States without any reference to Israel. And the problem is they would want to get something from Israel on Palestinian issues before they go ahead and sign this. And I think that with the current government in Israel, and again, we can talk a little bit about this if you want to in a few minutes, it's very unlikely that right now you're going to get a Saudi government where you have a 39-year-old leader who when he becomes king for a half a century going forward. He's a man who can be patient if he chooses to, with American politicians and Israeli politicians on a much more truncated timeline. I think that Mohammed bin Salman will see no need to rush into an agreement with Israel if waiting a few years will get Saudi Arabia a better deal. On the economic front, and this is where I kind of want to finish, Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030 is about a decade behind where the Emiratis are in terms of economic reform. And the Saudis are now realizing that and trying to catch up. But as I said, they really want the United States to help them do that. But Saudi Arabia is big. It's an ocean liner, or I like to think of it more as one of those really big cruise ships with like 10 or 12 decks of staterooms looking out the side. But the Emiratis are a little speedboat circling around that ocean liner. You saw a couple of weeks ago that Mohammed bin Salman pledged $1 trillion of trade and investment for the United States in the next 4 years. That would be the equivalent of about 1/3 of the GDP of Saudi Arabia during that period. So I am not sure he'll get to the $1 trillion mark, but I'm confident that there will be significantly increased investment and trade between Saudi Arabia and the United States in the next 4 years. So let me just recap my main points. I mean, I grew up in a bipolar world. I was a diplomat in a unipolar world, but we are now moving into a new world where there will be many, many actors trying to reach out to each other to maximize their own benefits as they see it. That doesn't mean that the United States is not influential. In fact, we remain the most influential country in the world. We can figure out how to exploit that for our own benefit. In the Middle East, there are 2 new countries and a couple of others that I know Sabri wants to ask about, who have decided that they take on the leadership role of the Middle East, but they're doing it not for the broader Middle East, they're doing it for their own interests. I've pushed a lot of information out. I hope I haven't thrown too many things at you, but I want to end with this thought. I mean, Mark Twain once said that speakers, when they get up and speak, should act like a child. You stand up, you say what you know, then you sit down and shut up. So I'm going to sit down right now, turn the microphone over to Sabri, and hopefully engage in a commerless form of discussion. So thank you all very much for listening to me.
Thank you for this wonderful talk. And I always wish that our speakers, especially professors, being one of them, could think so succinctly and be on time and finish on time. So that is not always happening, as you know. So as I told you, you were in for a feast, and I'm very glad that Ambassador Silliman went over kind of those 2 countries. Now, the region we're talking about is a very small area of the world. Maybe if you bring Saudi Arabia in, you're talking about a larger geography, but we're talking about 1%, 1.2% of the world's population. If you bring Iraq into the Gulf, perhaps we're talking about 2% of the world's population. But geography, God, geopolitics, geotheology, whatever, all of them combined gave them a lot of power. They golf. I grew up, of course, calling it the Persian Gulf. The Gulf holds about 50% of the proven oil reserves of the world, as we all know quite well, but also a significant chunk of the world's natural gas resources. But as Ambassador Silliman said, they are trying to get beyond what is the morning after, what is after oil. So those countries are, playing a very significant role. Of course, we did not mention Iran much, which is the other country that actually shares the Gulf, right? And Iran also holds a significant chunk of the oil and natural gas as well. And as you know, we have other problems with them. Now, one of the main questions I wanted to ask Ambassador is, I personally think MBS, as he's called, the future king, I think he's doing a lot of good, but he was discredited for some time. But my question, perhaps the first question I'll ask you is, you use the word top-down, right? Top-down social reforms. And I emphasize the social reforms, not just economic reforms. Now, the question is, how really those reforms reflect a genuine idea of liberalization? Do they? Or they are just instruments in consolidating regime stability and their global image?
I think it first of all depends on how you, good, and how you define well, support for all of these, what they really represent an attempt to bring popular support in. I think the answer is yes and no, but there are clever ways in which the Saudi government is trying to differentiate the ways in which they implement the social reforms so that those people who would like to see faster social reforms, more economic reform, maybe a little bit more of a push toward the private sector, but that's still hard in Saudi Arabia, but particularly the social reforms. For example, the Ministry of Culture in Saudi Arabia has a three-tiered system for how they have been expanding opportunities for tourism and entertainment for Saudis. For the top tier are the big cities, for Jeddah, for Riyadh, for Dammam Khobar on the East Coast. They are opening movie theaters. They are showing unedited international movies. They have musical concerts by Western groups or foreign groups. And it is common to see men and women eating together in restaurants. You will see people, young women pulling up in their new Mercedes, getting out of the car, wearing an abaya, the black overcoat, and a hijab, the head covering, but the abaya is open in the front and the hijab is sort of slung around the neck. So that you can see the hair and the jewels and everything they're wearing. So that's kind of for the population that is urbanized, more educated. They believe that that is the pace at which they can conduct reform. For second tier cities, cities of 100,000, 150, 200,000 people, where there is a more conservative social basis, maybe a little more concerned that you don't bypass Islamic tenets. They are opening movie theaters, but only showing Saudi movies. They are having concerts, both public and in theaters, where Saudi groups perform, but not necessarily the kind of people that I mentioned in my talk. There's also a third tier, which is for really small towns and rural areas, where they are mostly reaching out to women and providing opportunities for women to once or twice a week have a gathering in the park with other women, whether you bring your children along, because for many Saudi women in very conservative households, once you're married and have children, you very seldom leave your house. And what the Saudi government is trying to do is expose Saudi women to their neighbors, the people who are in their communities, create relationships, support relationships, but also friendships so that there's less loneliness, that there is more help when something goes wrong in one of the families, you have a broader community. So they're trying to calibrate the reforms that they make based on the communities in which they're trying to implement those reforms. The big ones, like in 2019, they signed a contract with Nicki Minaj, who is definitely not a normal Saudi performer, to do a concert. He pulled out of that contract because of the killing of Jamal Khashoggi in 2018. So she might have been there and this whole thing might have gone badly had she actually performed a concert in Riyadh. But the idea is, as I said, first of all, after energy, they want tourism to be their second earner of income. And they are trying to create world-class venues for Saudis to spend money on and for others later to come in and do as well. It didn't really answer your question, but what I'm saying is they're conscious of the differences in society and how the big changes that Mohammed bin Salman wants to make are still being calibrated throughout the society.
Now, sorry, I'm going to the,
Please.
I'm not trying to escape from you, but going to the mic. Now, one of the reasons I'm asking this question is because, this is a long fight in the Middle East. Modernization versus Westernization. Which route are we going to take? And how are we going to deal with the local culture? And two extreme examples being Turkey and Iran. One is an Islamic republic, one is a kind of soft Islamic republic. And a lot of people will tell you this is also a result of radical top-down modernization that the founders of those countries started. So we have that historic precedent. That's one of the reasons I had that question in mind. And more recently in Syria, as you know, parts of Syria is under Kurdish rule, and it's a very secular administration. And we still do not know how this will go. And when the Kurds try to do kind of radical reform and child marriage, no polygamy, no this and that, the traditional society in Raqqa and other places, they said, oh no, we're going to stop there. You can do it maybe in your region, but it's not in our. So that is the reason I'm kind of asking the question. And I'm very glad you used the word pace, that they are actually pacing.
Well, and somebody, let me make one other comment. Saudi Arabia has been sort of the quintessential rentier state, where the state pulls resources out of the ground, distributes it among the population, provides education, healthcare, housing, a lot, including higher education, a lot of things that just simply you don't find governments doing in other parts of the world. In some ways, Mohammed bin Salman's reforms are going to move away from that model. The money that comes into the country, the engine that drives the economy is still going to be energy, but it's going to be done through more entities. There will be more private sector engagement. There will be more parts of the Saudi government and more parts of the population doing different pieces of it. And the question is, will this succeed? I see this as one of the points where there could be some friction in the future if Western educated Saudis come back expecting that this will evolve into greater political rights, the ability to change policy, if not governments. They may be disappointed. But also people who have very conservative Islamic views and believe that because the center of Islam is in the Hijaz, in the kingdom, they must represent the deepest, truest values of Islam through government policy. You could also see some pushback, as you were talking about before, in Saudi Arabia. So I can see pushback from both the right and the left. And again, it will be a difficult struggle. Mohammed bin Salman has made a lot of rookie mistakes in the past 10 years. And he seems that some of the really horrible things like the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, but he seems to be able to recognize a mistake and recalibrate and do something different. And then the next mistake is a totally different mistake. But I think he will probably learn from that as well. So I am encouraged because he was young and brash. Now he's mostly just young and half brash. And as he gets older, maybe he will be calmer and think a little bit more about what.
The one question in relation to that is the money that is coming into the country and distribution of resource distribution. So one of the reasons that Turkish and Iranian models, in my mind, failed because the wealth stayed mostly on the top and didn't trickle down. And so the reaction to the very secular policies was not only cultural. And I think people are kind of missing the economic side of it, that a lot of parts of society were left behind. How is that working in Saudi Arabia? We know not everybody is driving a luxury Mercedes. Once I had a Saudi friend here and we lived in the same apartment. And so we were going somewhere and I'm going to his car and he's driving this beat down Toyota. I said, what is this? Where's your Mercedes? So, he kind of warned me that not everybody is happy. So how this part of the reform agenda is working?
Let me take the very top and the very bottom of the economic scale. Okay, yeah, so let me take the top and the bottom of the economic scale. At the very top, the concentration of power in the hands of Mohammed bin Salman has taken power away from the thousands of princes and related family members who feel that they have been disempowered. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it has created tension within the family. It looks like Mohammed bin Salman has overcome that tension, but it's something to watch in the future. I don't think there's going to be a real push from inside the Al Saud ruling family, but there is certainly some resentment that he is now controlling what many of his cousins and second and third cousins could make decisions on themselves. At the very bottom of the scale, it's a real problem. There are a lot of Saudis who are not very well educated. There are a lot of Saudis who have never had to really do a job. So many Saudis worked in government sinecures. They simply went there, would drink tea, and the people above them or around them who had skills would do the work, but they wanted to make sure that nobody was truly poor in Saudi Arabia. There's a really interesting movie that came out last year in Saudi Arabia called The Night Delivery Man, which is a Saudi-produced movie, and we talked about this a little bit last night, about a hapless Saudi guy. He just cannot keep a job, so he gets a job as a night food delivery man. And he's out making a delivery, and he sees some other guy delivering alcohol to a very wealthy English-speaking group of Saudis. And he follows this guy back to the warehouse, breaks into it, steals some of the alcohol and tries to sell it himself, and then both the gang that sells the alcohol and the police start chasing it. It's a tragic movie, but there is beginning to be on the part, this passed the Saudi censors. It was probably funded by the Saudi government, although they probably didn't fund the script specifically. But Saudis are beginning to examine really difficult social questions like that. I was shocked at the number of really sensitive touch points that this movie hit during the movie, but Saudi produced, shown in Saudi theaters, and now around the United States. So I think that there is discussion at both ends of the scale. The people in the middle will probably be all right, but there is now some focus on how do we keep people from falling out the bottom of the process.
Okay, so with your permission, I'll ask one more question. And that is kind of to bring the larger context. You mentioned Gaza, you mentioned the effort to bring Israel and extend the Abraham Accords. But the other place, of course, is Syria on the one side, that those countries source of the largest refugee and migration crisis of our lives. And you have Yemen, for extent, and those states, and I think we need to bring, as you mentioned, Qatar into the picture too, but they are also expanding beyond the region. They are playing roles in Libya, in Sudan, in Somalia. And then, of course, you have Turkey and Iran. Previously, everybody was talking about the Shia Crescent and the Persian Empire. And now in Syria, you have Turkey coming in. So one of the questions I have, AI, cloud seeding, and this and that diversification, how do you think they will kind of be able to also change a neighborhood? Because you cannot just have fences around your house and be very comfortable in there. You have to think about the neighborhood. And do you think they will be a source of good for the neighborhood?
Well, I'll start with Saudi Arabia and the UAE and the other Arab countries of the Gulf, and then kind of broaden it a bit. Saudi Arabia and the UAE are doing such radical reform at home. They cannot do this and have regional conflict at the same time. So both have engaged in separate and distinct, but progressive détente, if you will, with Iran. So the Emiratis went down this road first, probably in 2019. The Saudis, a year and a half ago, signed an agreement mediated by the Iraqis and the Omanis and finally by the Chinese, mostly to get Iranian pressure on the Houthis in Yemen to stop hitting civilian targets in Saudi Arabia, which has been effective since they signed the agreement. So the approach for most of the Gulf, and this includes Oman, this includes Kuwait, includes Qatar, not Bahrain so much, is to find a point of discomfort with Iran that both sides can live with, but that is below the level that would cause some sort of violent confrontation. And with Iran now weakened by the collapse of Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas was never a really big ally of Iran, being Sunni, not Shia, but it also hurt Iran's credibility as the one who can actually support an army that can liberate Palestinians from Israeli occupation, which is the rhetoric that they would use. Everybody now sees an opportunity to cut deals with Iran. Turkey possibly excluded in this. Turkey is on the ascent right now, and there is real difference of opinion in the Gulf about what to do about Turkey. I think the Saudis are willing to work with the Turks more closely. They want to make sure that the Turks have a productive vision for Syria, and the Saudis have been willing now to work with HTS and Ahmed Ashara, the new government in Damascus. The Emiratis, on the other hand, never liked Hamas, never liked Islamic Jihad. One of the reasons that their relationship with Israel is probably going to last the test of time is because they are very, very against extremist Sunni violence. So the Emiratis, who had been reaching out to the Bashar al-Assad regime before it collapsed 3 months ago, or 4 months ago now, had hoped to draw Syria back into the Arab fold, weaken Russian and Iranian influence. And when the Assad regime collapsed, they're now not quite sure what to do because they don't like Ahmed Ashara, because he's a former jihadi. So there's going to be, it's a new set of tensions, but it's an old issue. You mentioned Qatar.
Yeah.
There has been a lot of concern in the Gulf that Qatar, both through ideological support for more radical Islamist groups or far leftist groups in places like Al Jazeera has undercut the ability of particularly the Emirates or Bahrain to really get their own message out to their own populations. There is real concern in the Emirates that Qatar supports Islamist movements. And frankly, it was Qatar who worked with Israel to have discussions with Hamas before the attacks about how there could be economic development in Gaza that would be within the scope that Israeli governments could accept. So they were even talking just before October 2023 about bringing gas from Egypt or Israel into Gaza and building an independent Palestinian Gazan power plant. So there is some concern that the Qataris still remain too close to Hamas. And if you listen to Qatari statements, they seem to back very much away from public commentary on Hamas. I think they don't want to get too far out.
Because this caused a crisis in 2000.
Well, 2014, 2017, and there's no longer the late Emir of Kuwait was able to postpone it by a few years. But
One last one, were they able to bring Iraq in? Because when you were ambassador in Iraq, one of the big meetings that you had, when Rex Tillerson was there, you brought Iraqis to Saudi Arabia with this big meeting, but will that be possible?
I think it is possible because the current government in Iraq is less extreme and much more focused on actually governing. They have made a number of important economic decisions, signed contracts with American, British, French, and Turkish companies, which had been blocked for the better part of a decade by Shia extremists and militias, mostly sort of tied to beholden to Iran. So they have made some progress. The Emiratis have expressed less interest in investment and working with the Iraqis, but they see themselves a long way away. The Saudis are slowly working into investment, business, trade. They have facilitated the Hajj for Iraqis for now a number of years. But they remain very, very skittish about the possibility of radical Shia Islam coming out of Iraq. And this is one of the big fears of Bahrain, the biggest fear of Kuwait as well. So there is still this weight of Sunni fear about who actually runs Iraq. It's a big country. And since it is no longer Saddam, it's not people that we know and trust. They didn't like him, but they knew him and realized that he would not be a security problem for the Gulf countries.
All right, thank you very much. So I will stop here and sir, you raise your hand first.
What role do you see Saudi Arabia playing with respect to the Hamas-Israeli solution? And whatever that role is, how well do you think it would be accepted by the man in the street in Saudi Arabia?
Okay, I'm not entirely sure what role the Saudis are going to want to play. They have stayed out of a lot of specific discussions of what Gaza might look like after hostilities ended with some sort of a long-term ceasefire. I assume that they will be willing to bankroll some development, that they will be willing to bankroll reconstruction. I doubt that they would be willing to put Saudi forces on the ground unless possibly as part of the UN peacekeeping force. But the Saudi military is not as strong as some of the other militaries in the region. So I think they're going to be looked to finance things. And particularly if the United States asks them, if this happens under President Trump, they are likely to say yes to some extent. But I don't think they're going to be intimately involved in the details of planning and execute anything other than helping to finance it.
What concerns me about Saudi Arabia is their history. When the king of Saudi Arabia made a contract of the Wahhabism, this went into the school. They taught kids that as late as 15 years ago that the Jew needs to be killed no matter what. They taught that in the first grade, second grade, third grade. But what I'm interested in now, I understand all that economy and all these developments and everything, but the roots of the civilization in Saudi Arabia is at the first grade, second grade, third grade, fourth grade level. What have they done to change and revise and reform their educational system so that it's not so tied up with the imams and the clergy and wrote the books that you as ISIS used in Iraq to teach their own children.
You're absolutely right. I mean, in the last generation and into this generation, education in most of the Arab world, not just Saudi Arabia, was fairly anti-Semitic. They have changed the elementary and middle school and university curricula in Saudi Arabia. I think the bigger problem is not the curriculum anymore, but it is teachers who were taught under the previous curriculum who still kind of put this into the lessons because they believe it to be true. So I think this is a generational process. I don't know of people being fired from their jobs for teaching things that were old and not new, but I am having had conversations with people involved in the Ministry of Education, they're trying to change the way that young Saudi students look at the world. And they started this in particular with older Saudi students by sending so many of them outside the country to get new ideas, economic, technological, but also social back into the country. So it is a problem that is not going to go away immediately because these ideas are, as you said, ingrained in society. But what Mohammed bin Salman and almost everything that I talk about in Saudi Arabia, I have to say, Mohammed bin Salman has decided to do this. He's so much in charge in the center, has decided that the curriculum should not support anti-Semitism, should support the future broadening of Saudi's relations with all communities because they want to be a major player globally. They want relations with Israel. They just don't want to do it until the conditions that he has in his head are met to some extent. So the first step is taken. There are 3 or 4 more steps after that that will take a generation or 2 probably to work through.
Okay, we'll have a question from Professor Holyfield, but then I want a question from ladies in the room, as we just talked about Saudi Arabia. Now you are allowed to drive, okay? So you are, you can, I want ladies as questions too, not just men dominate everything. I'm sorry for the men in the room, but after you, we want a question from one of the ladies.
I feel like I should defer to the women. Quick question. You didn't say anything about all this activity with sports, but I have another question about your title, about the new power brokers. And it's almost as if the old power brokers have just disappeared. And I don't think you ever mentioned Egypt from the very beginning of your talk. And last time I checked, Egypt was a pretty big, populous country. And they do have relations with the Gulf states. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about where Egypt.
Well, I'm going to blame Ray because he said I had 20 or 25 minutes. The bottom line is the Saudis and the Emiratis are both very concerned about the stability of Egypt in particular, because as Egypt goes, the rest of the Middle East can follow, and they do not want Egypt to collapse economically. Interestingly, and sort of nearby, after the October 7th terrorist attacks and the Israeli attacks in Gaza, where a year and a half ago, the Saudis were messing a little bit in Jordan about the succession, they're now a little concerned about the stability of Jordan as well. A country that has far less economic basis within its borders and needs remittances and needs assistance from overseas. And now even their generally bipartisan support from the United States could be at risk if King Abdullah does something that President Trump or somebody doesn't like. So it's on a much less stable basis. I think that the Saudis and the Emiratis have both done a very interesting thing with Egyptians. Instead of giving them money, which they did 20 years ago, which usually often got wasted in corruption, or giving them money to put in the central bank to uphold the value of the lira, what they're doing now is buying large pieces of property, mostly beachfront or good industrial property, and promising to develop them. But as owners of the property, it'll provide money, income for Egyptians. It'll provide development opportunities around those communities. But the Emiratis and the Saudis have now bought 2 big pieces of property, I think one on the Mediterranean, one on the Red Sea, that they will develop themselves, but Egypt will get significant benefits from. So they're changing their strategy and how to help the Egyptians, but they're not just blindly giving money to Sisi because they were not happy with their.
There's still a lot of Egyptian.
There are still a lot of Egyptians working, but frankly, in Saudi Arabia in particular, they have gotten rid of a lot of the Egyptian and Filipino workers who used to be there, who used to work in retail. And these are the jobs that they have wanted Saudi women to take. And most of the Saudi women have displaced either Egyptians or Filipinos, not exclusively, but those were the two biggest groups that worked in that sector.
All right. No,
Thank you. When Salman, Prince Salman came in, or Prince Mohammed bin Salman came in, there was the arrest of a lot of the other princes and financiers in Saudi Arabia. They were put into the hotel. They were not allowed to contact family. And I don't really know what the denouement of all of that has been.
Well, I will tell you, I stayed in that hotel, the Ritz-Carlton, before this all happened. It is one of the least friendly hotels I've ever stayed in my life. It felt big marble walls and the lighting was kind of dim. And I said, I don't really like this hotel. I don't want to stay here ever again. So it was a really great place to put people. It's comfortable. The catering is pretty, the room service is pretty good, but you don't really want to stay there more than a week or so. The idea behind this was to try to I talked about these thousands of princes that in the past had real influence in ministries, in particular parts of the country that they essentially treated like fiefdoms. There was a lot of, if not corruptly gained money, money that wasn't really spent as it should have. Not as much money went to laborers, not as much money went back to the government in taxes. And there was a sense that MBS had that many people had unfairly gypped the system out of money. And this was not only the princes, but also some of the big Saudi businesses as well. So this was really an attempt to, I don't want to say shake down, but encourage a reckoning of these people with what they should have done over the past 20 years as they collected more and more money, and to make sure that what should have gone into the Saudi government coffers actually did in the end go into the Saudi government coffers. They kind of took them, chucked them upside down, and then picked the change up off the floor and put it into the Saudi.
historically, it's been a problem how to deal with the members of royal family, and especially if you have hundreds of them. Right? So it's not just a unique Saudi problem. Right? I'm sorry.
Hi, I'm Laila. I'm a senior fellow here at the Tower Center. Thank you for your great talk, very insightful. I have what is admittedly a big question, so please, feel free to focus on specific aspects of it. I'm curious about the role of China in all of this, geopolitically as well as economically. And then maybe to help you narrow down a little bit, specifically in relation to, in the context of Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states. I remember a couple of years back, China brokered an agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia. I haven't heard too much about it since, in my own ignorance. Curious to know where that has gone. Where is China today? Especially as the U.S. pulls back. I remember Biden when he was pulling out of Afghanistan, U.S. Afghanistan, saying, why are we're doing this in part because we shouldn't be maintaining peace in the Middle East, but subsidizing the ability of powers like China to operate more freely. How has all of that changed? So again, apologies for the question, but happy to hear any answer.
Let me give, I hope, 3 short answers. Economically, China is all over the Gulf and all over the Middle East. They can put in products cheaper than American and European companies can do it. They have more gifts and incentives to offer people who are making decisions than American and European companies do. They also come with financing, billions and billions of government provided financing. And I found in Iraq, at least, that many American companies had to partner with a Chinese company to get the financing to get the American part of the work done. So China is in the Middle East. It's going to remain there, and it's going to continue to sell things cheaply to governments that are going to want to cut costs. So this is part of this new networked world that I'm talking about. China is not going to go away. If the United States wants to reduce the influence of China, we just have to figure out where we have got a comparative advantage, where we really want to pressure Arab or Gulf governments to make a decision in our favor, and then leave part of the field to the Chinese, because they're always going to be there. Cultural issues. There are a lot of Chinese who live in the Gulf, but thus far, despite attempts to get people to train Chinese, go to university in China, there have been very few takers in the Gulf. In other words, people still want to learn English first before all other languages. China is the third or fourth on the list. It's coming up the list. But we have a couple of Chinese and Taiwanese scholars who work with who live in the Gulf, and they say Chinese tend to live in colonies that are isolated and haven't had a big social impact and don't get a lot of requests from the Arabs among whom they live for anything deeper than that. So culturally, I don't think Chinese culture has really caught on yet. Doesn't mean that it won't, but it's still very embryonic. The Saudi Arabia-Iran deal is a really complicated one. It started out with Iraqi mediation between Saudi Arabia and Iran to try to find a way to get the Saudis and the Iranians to talk directly. The Omanis took over with proximity talks and then direct talks, but they dragged on for the better part of 2 years. And the Saudis, during this period, were still receiving attacks from Ansar Allah, the Houthis from Yemen. They considered a proxy of Iran. And they were putting pressure on the Iranians through the Omanis to get the Iranians to stop the attacks from Houthis on Saudi civilian infrastructure. They said, we need help, but we can't really go to Washington because Washington has absolutely no influence with Tehran. Who can we talk to that might get the Iranians to agree with what we want? And they said, it's got to be the Chinese. They have other relationships, both defense and military defense and economic with the Chinese. And they said, if you can do this, the bottom line for us is that you have to get Iran to promise to stop the Houthis from attacking Saudi civilian infrastructure and into Saudi Arabia. The deal was signed and those attacks have basically stopped. The question is going to be, and this is something to watch in the future, if those attacks ever start again, does China do anything to put pressure on Tehran to stop the attacks? Does it try to enforce the terms of the agreement that it closed in the end, or will they just wash their hands of it? Because China, up to this point, has been very reluctant to enter politically into what they see as a political quagmire in the Middle East, and fears that they will have to take positions that will alienate parts of the population. They'd much rather have the United States doing that because they can say,
Who can blame them?
look at what the Americans did here, what the Americans did there, and they get political benefit, but they still have open trade routes. Thanks.
We have 5 more minutes. We have to end at 1:30, I believe, right?
Yes.
So we have one question and then we'll go to our oppressed male friends.
Sure. Mine's more personal than political, but do you have any advice or insight to people traveling to the region?
Go, it's wonderful. The answer is, 3 weeks ago, I got back from a trip to the UAE and to Kuwait. People were very friendly. I didn't feel anything different than usual. It's really easy. Frankly, immigration and customs and visas are getting easier. I got a Saudi online e-visa in less than 10 minutes. The Saudis, things are actually changing in the way that tourism is working. If you're going to do anything other than just go to see if you want to do research, you'll need different types of visas and it's a little bit more. But I would say go and see what's happening. Catherine and I were in Saudi Arabia at the beginning of last year, and we were just struck by the body language of Saudis, the space that Saudis take, the way that Saudi women move, even the way that the women all dressed in black with just a niqab and the eyes showing would move around malls. They used to go in little groups so that they would be safe from some sort of social attack. Now they've got popping bags and they're dragging the 3-year-old behind them, just like you might see in any mall in Dallas or Houston or Los Angeles. So there are real social changes that you might be surprised to see. I would say, honestly, right now, Egypt is probably not a great place to go. Jordan may not be a great place to go because of what's going on in the proximity. I would have no qualms about going to the Gulf or farther west into North Africa. I think that there's probably no real problem. A great place to go for tourism is Oman. And I'd love to talk about Oman.
I know we didn't have time. We have this gentleman ask a question.
What do you see for happening with Iran's attempt to develop atomic weapons? And how will that impact the Gulf states?
The Gulf states honestly don't care so much about whether or not Iran has nuclear weapons. It's Israel and the United States who care about whether or not Iran has nuclear weapons. The Gulf does not want Iran to continue to support militias or their own dissidents by arming them and training them. So they're much more concerned about the Houthis in Yemen, the Popular Mobilization Forces in Iraq, and are ecstatic that Hezbollah has been gutted by an Israeli intelligence operation. They're quite happy that Iran has basically withdrawn from Syria. So the Gulf really wants to see, as part of the negotiation of a new nuclear agreement, if President Trump is able to get to that point, something that covers not only a nuclear agreement, which would be good for them, but something that covers and includes an Iranian pledge to stop funding the dissidents that they have been funding for the past 40 years, because that's the greater danger for the Gulf. The one thing that's going to be hardest, though, is Iranian missiles and drones, because the Iranians have used missiles and drones to attack targets inside Saudi Arabia, both directly and indirectly through their proxies for the past 5 or 6 years. And that is really their strongest strategic reach. You've seen what they were able to do against Israel.
Or not.
Or not. I mean, they can actually get missiles that far. This is one issue that's going to be bigger and may require a more global negotiation under Missile Technology Control Regime, MCTR, something like that. But the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Kuwaitis really want to see, no nuclear weapon, but I think that the Iranians will agree to that under certain conditions. But what the Gulfis really want, and what King Abdullah in Jordan really wants, and what Sisi in Egypt really wants, is an end to Iranian support to more radical groups that will oppose their governments.
And today, I guess they released the underground missile facilities parading them today.
But they walked over an Israeli flag, but for the first time, not an American flag. It was not an American flag on the ground as they were walking through.
This is great thinking, we know that already.
Well, I mean, these little things, and I say this because I have a really good Iran analyst who sent me an email and said, wow, this is actually significant that they did not roll these missiles over an American flag, only rolled them over an Israeli flag. That shows flexibility that he did not expect to see.
All right, last question.
Stable is Iran. We saw it born in a revolution, watched on television, have lived through its entire national lifetime, modern national life. How stable is it?
How stable is Iran? Iran is actually pretty stable for a couple of different reasons. Put this very simply, Iran also has red states and blue states. There is an urban, educated, more liberal elite. There are people who have farms and ranches and businesses out in the countryside or in smaller towns. If they ever agree on whom they oppose, there might be instability. But in all of the last 30 years, when they have elected 3 progressive presidents and there has been a move toward reform, the cities in the countryside have not been unified in the way they wanted to go. So one side would revolt, and then the other side would just sit and do nothing. And then that would be reversed 10 years later. So the regime is actually quite stable. If we assume or we believe that when Ayatollah Khamenei passes at some point, the real power is likely to pass to the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps through people in the clergy who support the IRGC. And that they will be relatively strict in their attempts to keep Iran unified and to keep their control together. That could change. And we can have a whole nother hour discussion about the Iranian elections and Masoud Pezeshkian and where things are going. But Iran is not an unstable country. It's just a poor country under a lot of pressure, both domestically and internationally.
And also just to add that I think Iran, for last 40 years, invested very heavily on how to counter and suppress social movements. And in 2019, if you remember the Green Revolution, then last 2 years ago, the women's movement, they were very big social movements, but they were able to suppress them. And because they always, when you are in Iran, they say, we are not going to be a country that will be coupled with a velvet revolution. And they've been threatening for this. They've been really arming themselves, not just against others, but against their own population to suppress them. And so in that sense, it's stable. I'm afraid we have to stop here. And that's why we're going to have other events that you guys will come. But thank you all. Thanks for coming and supporting our And thank you for our distinguished guests.
Thank you.